At precisely 4:35 on August 7, 1942, the dense jungle of Guadalcanal erupted with a sound that Japanese soldiers had not anticipated. From beyond the tangled foliage and mist, a thunderous chorus echoed, deep, concussive thumps that rolled across the Lunga perimeter. Seconds later, fire rained from the sky. The Japanese outposts, dug into coral ridges and camouflaged foxholes, shook as if the earth itself had turned against them. The men had heard American rifles and machine guns before. They had endured artillery shells from naval guns pounding the coast. But this sound was different. It was sharper, closer, and unrelenting. Within moments, their carefully prepared defensive line dissolved into chaos as explosions churned soil, shredded timber, and scattered human bodies in a storm of steel fragments. U.S. Marine Corps Combat Report, August 1942. For the Japanese defenders, it was a nightmare that made little sense. Their doctrine taught them that Americans were clumsy and predictable in jungle fighting, relying on heavy naval fire or artillery batteries that could not penetrate the inland thickets. But this rain of destruction was mobile, immediate, and devastating. Entire squads vanished in seconds. The enemy's foxholes seemed to have been spotted with uncanny precision. Survivors shouted through the smoke, "Kisho! Kisho! Earthquake! Dramatis composite!" But these were no tremors of nature. This was the voice of a weapon the Japanese had gravely underestimated: the American mortar. The Marines had lugged their 60 mm and 81 mm tubes through mud and heat, manhandled them over ridges, and set them up in clearings carved with machetes. In less than 2 minutes, these portable weapons were raining indirect fire on enemy positions that had once seemed untouchable. Each round screamed through the air in a low arc before bursting in showers of fragments that cut down men who thought their cover was safe. The Japanese doctrine of shallow foxholes and bamboo overhead cover proved fatally inadequate. Their field manuals had not prepared them for the precision, volume, and mobility of American mortar teams. Imperial Japanese Army Field Manual, 1939. The shock spread quickly. Captured diaries after the battle revealed Japanese disbelief. The shells came from nowhere like angry gods. They fell behind hills, into gullies, everywhere. We could not silence them. Bundasakev, Captured Diary, 1942. To them it was as if the Americans had bent the laws of war itself, delivering artillery without artillery, bombardment without batteries. This opening act on Guadalcanal was not an isolated scene but a glimpse of a broader truth. In 1942, across the Pacific Islands, a subtle yet decisive transformation in battlefield firepower was underway. The mortar, often overlooked in grand histories of tanks and bombers, was rewriting the balance of infantry combat. Its roots stretched back centuries, to the stubby siege weapons of early modern Europe. But in the crucible of World War II, mortars found their apotheosis. Engineers in American factories, from Watervliet Arsenal in New York, to the shops of Firestone Tire and Rubber, repurposed for war, perfected designs that were lighter, faster to produce, and easier to operate. These tubes, often no taller than a man's chest, became the hidden artillery of every U.S. infantry platoon. Ordnance Depth, Production Report, 1942. The Pacific Theater made the mortar's strengths brutally clear. On jungle islands where visibility was short, terrain was broken, and targets hid in ravines, traditional field guns faltered. Naval bombardments flattened shorelines but left inland defenses untouched. The Japanese knew this and designed their bunkers accordingly. But the mortar negated these assumptions. With a high plunging trajectory, a mortar round could drop into ravines, behind ridges, or through the roof of a dugout. It could be carried on the shoulders of 2 Marines, set up in minutes, and unleash destruction on positions naval gunnery could not touch. U.S. Army After Action Report, February 1943. Numbers told the story of scale. By the end of 1942, the U.S. military had produced over 50,000 mortars of various calibers, from the portable 60 mm to the heavy 4.2-inch chemical mortars. Production surged further as the war expanded, with tens of millions of rounds pouring out of Midwestern factories. Each steel tube was simple but deadly efficient: a smooth-bore barrel, a base plate hammered into earth, a bipod for adjustment, and a drop-fire mechanism that made every round a swift act of mechanical certainty. War Production Board Report, 1943. In contrast, Japanese forces relied heavily on their so-called knee mortars, the Type 89 grenade dischargers. While ingenious in design, these small light weapons lacked the range and explosive power of American mortars. They were excellent for harassment fire and close support, but in defensive battles against advancing Marines, their light shells could not stop coordinated assaults. Japanese commanders expected their artillery to carry the burden of countering U.S. infantry firepower, but artillery could rarely be resupplied on isolated islands under Allied naval blockade. Mortars, fed by American logistics chains that stretched back to San Francisco and Pearl Harbor, never seemed to run dry. This imbalance grew starker with every month of the war. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The psychological impact was immense. Survivors of early mortar bombardments recalled the unique terror of their sound. Unlike naval shells that screamed and whistled with long approach, mortar bombs dropped with suddenness, a soft hiss, then an explosion that shattered ears and nerves alike. Foxholes that had once felt safe became traps, and defensive positions became death zones. There was no rest. One Japanese soldier later recalled under interrogation, "We would think the firing had stopped, then suddenly another bomb would fall into our trench." U.S. Intelligence Interrogation Report, 1945. Commanders on both sides took notice. U.S. Marine General Alexander Van der Grift credited mortar teams with breaking multiple Japanese counterattacks at Guadalcanal, citing their ability to stop charging troops before they reached American lines. Marine Corps Memoir, 1946. Meanwhile, Japanese staff officers wrote in frustration about invisible artillery that could not be tracked or silenced. They devised countermeasures, raids on mortar crews, night infiltration, and camouflage, but the American reliance on overlapping fields of mortar fire meant the weapon was not tied to any single point. Kill one crew, and another would pick up the fire. By late 1942, what began as a tactical edge was maturing into a strategic pattern. The Americans had found a weapon perfectly suited to their doctrine of firepower-intensive, casualty-averse operations in the Pacific. Mortars became not just a supplement but a backbone of infantry fire support, giving every battalion the power once reserved for divisional artillery. The Japanese could not believe the scale and precision with which these weapons were used. What they mistook as earthquakes on Guadalcanal was merely the first tremor of a storm that would roll across every contested island in the Pacific. But the mortar's full impact was not yet visible. Behind the jungle firefights and the desperate foxholes, a deeper truth waited to be revealed, a truth of design, industry, and tactical doctrine that made these weapons more than mere tubes of steel. It was not just the presence of mortars that crushed Japanese defenses. It was how they were engineered, deployed, and supplied with relentless efficiency. The secret lay in the marriage of American industry and battlefield innovation, a hidden advantage that the Japanese would only come to grasp when it was far too late. And as the jungle of Guadalcanal smoldered in 1942, the world had only seen the beginning. The next chapter would reveal why these humble tubes became one of the most feared instruments of modern war. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. Dawn broke over the volcanic sands with a haze of sulfur and smoke. The first waves of Marines staggered ashore under withering Japanese fire. Heavy machine guns and concealed artillery tore into the landing craft. Yet as the battle unfolded, something unexpected shifted the balance. Just inland, beyond the reach of naval guns, mortars began to speak. By mid-morning, the black sands echoed with the steady thump-thump-thump of dozens of tubes, their concussions blending into the rhythm of war. Each round arced silently upward before plunging down into Japanese bunkers carved into rock. The explosions were immediate, precise, and terrifyingly effective. The defenders, who had spent months constructing elaborate caves and interlocking fields of fire, suddenly found their sanctuaries shredded by a weapon they had underestimated for 3 years. U.S. Navy log, February 1945. This was the hidden advantage: American mortars. Not the crude, limited knee mortars of Japanese platoons, but industrially engineered, mass-produced, and relentlessly supplied weapons that multiplied American firepower at every echelon of command. At Iwo Jima, on Peli-U, on Saipan, mortars became the weapon that broke the stalemate of close combat. Their presence explained why Japanese diaries so often described a war that felt like fighting against thunder itself. Bundesarchiv, Captured Diary, 1944. To understand why, one must go beyond the battlefield smoke to the engineers and factories that made this transformation possible. The standard U.S. infantry mortar in 1942 was the 60 mm M2, a weapon weighing just 42 pounds, portable by 2 men. It fired a 3-pound shell up to 2,000 yards, high enough to clear jungle canopies yet accurate enough to land on a foxhole hidden in ravines. Its larger brother, the 81 mm M1, weighed 136 pounds in total and could lob a 7-pound shell over 3,000 yards. For even heavier tasks, the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, originally designed for gas warfare but repurposed for high explosives, could hurl 25-pound shells nearly 4,500 yards with devastating accuracy. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. These specifications were not abstract numbers, they were the difference between life and death. At Peli-U, Japanese defenders believed their caves in the Umabrogol ridges were invulnerable. Yet 81 mm rounds, fired in sustained barrages, cracked open entrances, and buried machine gun nests under tons of collapsing rock. After-action reports praised mortars as the single most effective weapon against Japanese fortifications, eclipsing even flamethrowers in certain engagements. Marine Corps Division Report, September 1944. But it was not only the design, it was the logistics. American industry ensured a near-limitless flow of ammunition. At the peak of 1944, factories in Pennsylvania and Michigan produced over 10 million mortar rounds in a single year.